Okay, can everyone hear me? Anyone out there? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
I can hear you too.
Awesome. Awesome. Let me try and move this camera a little bit. Suppose more people know. Great. Well, thanks for coming. I know we have some broad interest in this meeting. I think the only thing on the agenda today really is to go through some of the changes for Istio 1.0 and basically as they apply to telemetry. So I put together a little sort of summary of some of the issues that had come up and docs related to those issues that led to the changes. And I wanted to speak to a little bit about what's really new for 1.0. And then I think I see some of the people from the Chiali team online that had some questions and wanted to talk about the work that they're doing. So hopefully we can transition to that. Does that sound good? Okay. So the big changes for 1.0 in terms of what's available for telemetry are that we have enabled client-side reporting as well as the server-side reporting that existed in the previous releases. And so what this really means is that we can get insight into things that are events like fault injection and circuit breaking that actually happen on the client-side proxies and not server-side proxies. And this was a big hole in our telemetry story prior to this release. And so this release will address that bit of missing telemetry. And the other big change in telemetry was that we shifted away from sort of search service to destination service relations to focusing on source workload to destination workload communications. And those are the really big changes. And there was a lot of communication and conversations about that, which I tried to link in the background section of the agenda. So that's sort of what's really new about the 1.0 telemetry. And then out of that, we updated the dashboards and a bunch of different things, but I think that's the primary, those are the two primary changes that are worth mentioning. So now I know that the Chiali team had some questions and I want to turn the floor over to them to sort of ask and lead discussion about the things that they wanted to raise in this meeting.
All right, thanks, Doug. You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, this is John Mazzatelli. So first off, thanks, Doug, and everyone else for helping us out when we're sending emails to the list. You guys helped out a lot. So we're probably, I would say probably a couple months behind what you guys had, because we look back on all the discussions you guys had about the whole service stuff versus workload stuff. We've started having those conversations. We went back and we looked at your docs and threads and found out you guys basically had the same conversations a few months ago. So this whole move from service to workload, we've seen issues. We're making that move now. So what we're going to do is we're going to start doing a visualization of workloads, basically. However, we're looking at the app and version labels, and we want to make use of those. The one question we have is, and I know we've discussed this before, we know it's optional, we know it's just a suggestion, but what does the Istio team think about the Chiali UI putting emphasis on the app label? We're thinking about, if the app label's there, we're going to use it. If it's not there, we won't break, but we would prefer the app label to be there.
So sort of historically, we have relied on the app label for, the example service graph that shipped with Istio and other things. So I think we are okay with recommending that people use the app label to identify sort of service or application or whatever term we've application that we want. So I think that sounds okay from my perspective, and I don't know if others want to comment on that.
So did we actually add source app?
Yes.
So source app and definition app, and that's from the app label?
Yes.
And then yeah, I think clearly we're saying you should use this as a grouping mechanism.
That's what we thought, and yes, they are labeled on the Prometheus metrics. That's why we wanted to concentrate on using them if they're there, not unknown. But I
certainly
mean,
was.
personally, I was just getting hung up on the fact that it was optional, and we're not sure if it's okay to, at least if we know it's optional, but we really strongly recommend using it.
Yeah, certainly the intent was, hey, we know that it's going to be harder to sort of group workloads, and we want a way to aggregate across workloads, and app was the way that we are pushing as the way to do that for now.
Okay. One of the questions me and Jay's also on the call, we were just talking about this before we got on this call, was the way the app label was used in the example, in the book info example. It seems like the app label was more narrowly used in the book info demo. We're not sure if it's how it's recommended to use it. For example, the app label is the same name as the service name. So there's no real Uber grouping here that the app label gives outside of just a service name. I guess the question is, we should not assume that's going to be the case, right? The app label should be something more global use. I guess it's a wrong term, but it's not just a service name, but that's not the intent of the app label, right?
So others may, I'll give one perspective on it, right? So the book info example is sort of limited in that we only ever have one deployment for each of the services. So we're not rolling out, well, I guess there are some examples where we roll out V2 and V3 ratings. Yeah, so if you want to track ratings across all three of those versions, or reviews across all three of those versions, the only way to do that is with the app label.
Yeah, okay, that was one of my points.
Isn't there also one service that points to all of them?
There is one service that points out, but from a source communication standpoint.
Yeah. The only way to get it from our metrics,
Yes, and we're strictly talking about the Prometheus metrics, right?
Yeah. Right. I think the general idea is that there can only be one app label on any workload. So it's more useful than service because of that. Right.
But they can be the same across deployments, i.e. the reviews from book info.
Right. It can be across multiple deployments. Yeah.
And that's how we're going to group versions in that case.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the idea, what we're doing is, and through using the app labels, how we did this. And I'll put a link to some of the demos that we have in case you guys haven't seen the Kiali UI. But the idea is we have these versioned workloads. Think reviews 1, reviews V2, reviews V3. We actually group them in a version box because we know the app label is reviews. So we know, okay, these are related. But we have 3 workloads within this related group called reviews. So that's what we were using the app label for. Because like you just said, you can't get that by just looking at workload.
Right.
Okay.
Actually, John, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but one thing I think would be cool, and if you have it available, is if you could just show a brief demo of Kiali.
I can show you some snapshots, and if you really put me on the spot, I might be able to do a demo. But let me just show you some. What do you want?
Yeah, the snapshot is fine. I mean, I know how hard it is to sort of like on the fly send up a demo, but I mean, I've looked at some of the stuff you sent, but.
I think the snapshots I show you might be helpful.
Okay.
You cannot share screen while others are, you got to unshare.
Yeah, I will stop sharing and let you take over.
You tell me what you see.
I can see your screen.
Okay, so you see the graph, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, wait.
Oh, only you see the screen. Okay.
So what you're seeing is here is, hopefully it's obvious, it's the book info demo, right? And you can see the box of reviews with V1, V2, V3 in it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
But we're using the app label here to be able to group these. If we were not looking at the app label, we were just going with source workload and destination workload, we wouldn't be able to produce that box. You see reviews. We would only be able to show V1, V2, V3 circle nodes without any notion of them being related to one another.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
Yeah.
go ahead.
I was just saying, and that was the intent of adding that app label, is to allow grouping like this.
Okay.
We want to be able to aggregate like that.
Yes. Yeah, okay. So, and you can see the diamond on the left. The diamond denotes a source of requests. And Jay, correct me if my definition is wrong, but a diamond's supposed to represent what, a root or a source of requests?
Yeah, basically that it's a request generation sort of node. It's where things are starting to come in. Although, you know, what we're missing here is actually the real diamond would be in this case like the internet, because you're just sending them in.
Yeah, that's the next point I'll bring up later. Now, all right. So what you see up top here is the detail. Now this doesn't quite follow the book info demo because I added this blob up here. What I actually did was I added a second details workload or deployment, but I put a fault injection in front of it. So this basically is illustrating the new stuff you guys implemented, the client side error metrics. So what this is saying is product page tried to make a request to some details service, but it didn't make it because we injected a fault there. So there's no server side metric, but there is that client side metric. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Does that everyone else follow?
So the unknown doesn't have a version label. Is that it?
Yeah,
it's known that the app label is correct and.
Yes. So think about what happened here. It tried to send a request to a destination service, but it never made it. It never got to the protein server-side proxy. And why?
Okay.
Because we injected a fault in there. We had some fault injection we shoved in there. So what we're denoting here is it tried to send a request to details, but we don't know where. In other words, the Prometheus label of workload, destination workload, was unknown. But yet service.
Right. So this does not seem to distinguish between a 404 that's routing error, client-side routing error, and a 404 that's legitimate server-side 404. Because looking at that, I could not tell whether it was the application that sent back a 404, or you're trying to say that the attempt was an incorrect attempt was made to send it to something that doesn't exist.
So the idea that we haven't implemented this yet, right, is somehow, and maybe you guys have some ideas how to do it, we would either, I don't know, double click this unknown to drill down in here, maybe drill down into this edge. You would get a drilled in graph view, and then you can get your client side and server side metrics. And then you could hopefully distinguish between, oh, this was a request that never even made it, or it did make it and it was an app error that returned back.
Well, remember, a 404 that would come from, if it made it to the destination workload, it wouldn't have the arrow going to unknown. It would be going to one of the specific versions.
That's true. If it made it, you'll see like if it made it to V1, but V1 threw back some kind of status code of 404, this edge would be red. But in the case of we don't know where it was going because it never made it, that's what this edge looked like.
Yeah, I mean, I see your point, but I think it's still kind of unclear from this, right? I mean, it is a byproduct of using client-side metrics, so that's there.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I would just say that
remember,
this is the very first thing that we got to generate on 1.0 at all.
Right.
So we haven't really played with anything yet as to making it perhaps more easy to understand.
Because remember, prior to this, obviously we've just been dealing with your server-side metrics. It's only right since the 1.0 client-side metrics came in that now we're starting to play with it, and we're not quite sure exactly how to visualize it. Now,
Yeah, and actually,
So,
let me go to the next one, just so you can see. Now, this is looking at your apps, and we've got individual versions here. So I call this the version graph. But if you see here, this graph, here you can see the ingress coming to the product page. Now, notice we don't show any of the versions. This is just a collapsed view. This still shows apps, right, Jay? We're still using the apps query here.
yeah, definitely. This is an app view. In fact, the service graph label up top would be more likely to say app graph.
For this, these aren't services anymore, which you guys but the point
yeah,
here,
we've had that issue as well.
apps, right? You don't see version 1, 2, or 3. You just know this is the reviews app, and this is the details app. And this red node, like you said, we don't know what this means. Is this did it not meet the details? Is this a 503? Is this a 4? We don't know anything about this. All we know is some kind of errors happen in the details. And then the idea here is maybe we double click the edge and we go to some other drilled in view or whatever.
Okay. What happens if any errors occur on a communication, say between products and reviews? Does that turn red?
It would.
Or is
yeah.
it like, if it's 90% success, what happens?
Yeah, we have different, we have DMARC, like you would see orange if 10% of the flow were errors. You would see error, you would see orange, then it would turn red if it was like greater than 10% or something like that. We haven't
So these are color coded by success rate then?
Yeah, so I wish I had it here. We actually had animations here too, where you would see dots, kind of like the visceral graphs. I know you guys know visceral because everyone says, "You guys thought about?"
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So everyone loves visceral. So we actually do have animations where you'll see dots flowing from the edges from start to finish. The dots will speed up. The number of dots change depending on throughput and response times. So you'll see animations. You'll see, like I said, you'll see different colors: orange if some errors, red if there's a lot of errors. We have the chance to label these edges so we can show response times and different numbers on the edges here. Let me see if I can.
I think kind of the main point, though, is that what we've come to understand in the last few days with the back and forth on the email list is that even though we are exploring what we can do here using app labels, we have to assume that they might not be there or they might not be set up in a way that we can leverage them very well. So we are definitely going to have to provide a graph that is workload to workload based, or workload to requested service also needs to be represented in the graph for the client side failures.
Right.
So that's key, but that's why we're so interested in app, because we feel like even though it's optional, if everybody's using it and everybody uses it the same way, we could leverage it a lot.
Right. So I really want to ask the question here. Clearly there's a problem where the people trying to build UIs and experiences around this stuff need to create a certain user experience, and they're struggling to do so with what they currently have. So we have the Kiali team working towards using the app label, right? The problem with the app label is that it's sort of a loose convention. It's not actually a core mechanic. And so they can build an optimized experience around the app label, but they still have to support all the mess of other possible ways in which a user could actually put their system together, right? Which is a familiar problem to us. My question is, so if we're okay with Kiali recommending that you should use the app label in this specific way and pushing this usage throughout the community, the app label is fundamentally not secure. It is not, there's no provenance around, that a user can label their pod however they want.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, that app is going to be the label selector that this incoming service uses to select those pods. So it kind of feels like we're taking a big sidestep to avoid a technical issue, but then leaving all of the baggage there in kind of a worse way, right? So I'm wondering if we're okay with using labels as the means of identifying the sort of business logic unit that is associated with a workload. Instead of standardizing on app, so in the GKE UI, for instance, you can see all of the ways in which a pod is selected, right? At least I think you can. If we had a reverse index of labels to services or pods to their services, you actually would be able to identify this sort of stuff in a more generic way, right?
So I think there's a couple of things there. So one is that the app label is already being used, as you mentioned, for people doing service selectors, right? So I think if it's good enough for that from a sort of security standpoint, I don't think it's like using it for observability is any worse.
Exactly.
It's strictly less important. And I think you already have namespace controls, so I'm not too worried about the ACLing problem there, as long as like label is still scoped to namespace in some sense, and you make sure those don't cross. I think the second part, the index to service, in some ways that's strictly worse because service can be many-to-many relationship, whereas a workload can only have one label of a particular name. And that's actually the property we're looking for grouping, is that you have a particular, one-to-one relationship. So it's one-to-many, right, not many-to-many.
Right, totally. So let me backtrack a little bit. I think I got lost. I guess what I'm asking is there a way in which, rather than this loose label selection mechanic, if we could actually say the proper way to do things in the optimized best case is that you have a one-to-many as opposed to a many-to-many relationship. You use the app label as your selector. And in that case, Istio will give you some extra semantics around that particular use case, as opposed to, I don't know, this just feels so rough from the standpoint of
Daniel, what I don't understand is it's not such a big departure from the way things are in Istio, and even if you look at just plain Kubernetes, like even their examples, everything uses app label. So we didn't just like we chose app label because there was some like prior art and there was some acceptance of it before Istio came along. And the only thing I see here, right, to kind of your earlier point, is that app label itself is not namespaced. It is absolute, which means that someone from a completely different namespace can claim that, yeah, my app is now finance app, and screw up everyone's metrics. So
I think that's what I'm saying. I think we have to include namespace in that, right? You have to namespace the labels.
But more importantly,
we need to make the namespace included to make this to not allow
to not allow for that.
And does Kubernetes actually allow that? Like if you have I think service selectors are automatically namespace scoped.
Yes, service selectors are namespace scoped.
So they do the same thing, right? You can't, even if you label it with the same like front end in a different namespace, the service selector won't.
But one of the explicit goals of having an app label, which is actually more free flowing, is that you can group together larger items
across multiple namespaces.
Yes. So there is a bit of tension between the two.
That gets tricky.
I think it's important to think about multiple clusters as well, because in the multiple cluster case, you could have two namespaces with different Kubernetes RBAC, but with the same name that Istio will treat as the same namespace. So it is the case that you could have a service that points at a label selector where someone else can control the labels on that.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a a known issue with just generally an Istio multi-cluster that don't do that, right? Like don't have different RBAC on different clusters because you'll run into problems.
I will say the Kiala team, we know about the cross-cluster issues. We have not concentrated on thinking about it much at all right now.
Well, I mean, my understanding is metrics are still currently broken in a cross-cluster world. So until those are fixed, then it's sort of a moot point.
So I think we do. I think everyone would like there to be some better mechanism than a label.
Yes.
For grouping. I don't know how involved any of us have been in the Kubernetes application definition stuff.
Not very.
Maybe we should get more involved there and see if we can make sure that group knows about the requirements we have on the space, and see if that would, like, if they're doing something that would solve the problem, then maybe we can reuse that. If not, maybe we have to look at something ourselves. Yeah, I think it's a stopgap. It's clearly not ideal.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's actually two issues here, right? So one is pulling the value for the metric label from the Kubernetes pod label, and one is what we call the metric label itself. Right? So if we build things around using source app as the metric label, how we populate that value can change over time,
right? And
we can adjust that to better understanding. So that's just something else. For like the Cali folk, like you almost don't care in essence how the value is derived.
Right. Exactly.
And the Istio team cares about deriving the value.
Yeah, I think as long as we make a guarantee of this is guaranteed to be one to many, whereas an app will point to many workloads, but any workload only has one app.
Right.
And as long as we keep that guarantee, yeah, it doesn't matter where that's coming from.
And by the way,
go ahead.
While not as big of a problem, but a very similar problem is with the version label too. Because again, that's just the label, optional. But
right.
we look at that too, right, to figure out, this node, this workload has a version of v1 and not unknown, but it's got v1 or v2. And of course, we're picking that out of the version label too.
So I think to that point, right, one of the things, labels are by definition arbitrary, and it is up to the deployer to impart any kind of meaning to it, right? Like whoever deploys it assigns labels, imparts meaning, and then they see the same thing in their monitoring. So from a flip side, I guess one thing we could do is have the app label and the version, like essentially have a workload identifying labels as a configurable thing, which I think app and version has shown to be sufficient so far.
Yep.
But if someone comes along and says that they need app, version, and I don't know, something third thing to be included in however they group their stuff, then I think all our monitoring should be able to pick that up and say, okay, fine, like you group it in these ways, so that's what I'm going to follow along. So if we don't want to be prescriptive, then we can do that.
And
yeah, there's some problems.
Sort of already, right? Because you take your metric definitions and your source app can be whatever you want. Really, you just happen to take the app label, but we can make that a deployer can make that whatever they want.
Yeah. I think there's two parts to that. So one is what things show up in the metric labels, to Doug's point. And I think that is a little bit harder to change in some cases where like you can't necessarily arbitrarily add new dimensions and have like Kiali understand those, right?
Right.
So I think the dimensions of the metrics are a little bit harder to change.
Mm-hmm.
Where the data from those dimensions is coming from though is easy. Yeah, that's just configuration. But I think it is good to have like concepts, like semantic concepts of an app and a version, and have definitions for what those mean, and say like they need to match these semantic meanings.
Right.
And those are what those metric labels mean. Go ahead. Sorry.
There's one other issue with this approach, I think. So it works very well to give you grouping of your metrics. What it doesn't do is give you a unit that you can look at all of your observability information around one concept, right? So great, you created an app label. How do you look at the policy associated with that app? How do you look at the routing information associated with that app, right? Like you're fracturing the concept model for one particular subvertical of Istio and making it work for metrics, but our UIs are all going to eventually encompass all of the different aspects of running a service or app or workload or whatever it is that we call it, right?
Well, it's
Yeah,
interesting actually.
That's a great point.
We were talking about this earlier today, right? So let's say you have that graph and you've got a node that represents an app. So then you want to look at it. You want to see what it does. So how do you get from that node to something with more detail, right? We're like, okay, you start with the app. From the app, we can get the workload. From the workload, we can map it to services. And then eventually you can drill down to the services that you're interested in. So there is like this big indirection between getting from app to what you really want to see, which is some rule on your service or something like that.
Right. And this is kind of the thing that I sort of feel like we're ignoring the elephant in the room, which is that to provide value, you ultimately do have to backtrack to the service, right?
Yes, we were just talking about that. Yes. Totally.
Right. So, and it's possible to do that, right? So I would just like, I don't know, I would really like, and I understand the historical context and the philosophical context for why this is not the case, but I would like to see more opinion built into Istio that allows us to be more concrete about these relationships, and sort of make these inferences not through multiple chains of I hope the user did this following conventions, but this is the way the system works and it's intended to work in a sane way holistically from end to end.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
It does make sense.
Totally makes sense. And that was the one question I was gonna come in here with. The question I was gonna ask is, what can we require the user to do to make the system work? Like right now, you're not required to use the app label. You're not required to use the version label. It would be nice. Things work better. And I don't know if there's something we can require them to use, but it would be nice if there was something.
Yeah, I don't think to date that we have pushed any real requirements on the user in terms of structuring deployments or anything, right? That sort of,
which is the nice, which is a nice thing, right? We agree that that's a nice thing.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, going back to what I think it was Daniel was just saying, right? Up until 0.8, it was sort of like ignorance is bliss, because we were showing this nice service to service graph, given the metrics that we had back then. And it made perfect sense, right? So when you're observing something, one thing you want to have is you want to understand what you're observing. Workloads to workloads, which are then indirect to services in a way, are maybe a little more complicated to understand. We were looking at service to service, even though we were kind of in a dream, right? Because it wasn't really service to service. It was all stuff we didn't understand.
Well, the specific thing here is that even that time, when ostensibly it was service to service, it was actually app label to app label, because that's how that name was being derived. So it was already app label to app label.
Label to service, wasn't it?
That's what Jay was talking about when he said we were in the dream world. We thought we were looking at services. We were really looking at things with app labels.
Right. Yeah. That was the dark secret. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now we're just making it official.
But the nice thing was that it actually gave us something that seemed very understandable: requests from service to service.
Yeah, only because the app label was there.
Exactly. But what I'm trying to say is, right, I think everyone gets, is just that there was a simplicity to that, which made it easier to observe, and we could easily link from a service node back to the service definition and things like that. So from an observability perspective, it actually was potentially easier. And now we're struggling a little bit trying to get back to that simplicity and wondering, hey, can we force this app label? Can we depend on it? Stuff like that.
Yeah. No, I think that's all fair, and I think we all generally agree. I mean, to Daniel's point, I think there's a larger thing that needs to be solved across Istio that's outside of just telemetry, and that's the link between virtual services and the network policy, and how like the policies and telemetries that this working group is concerned itself with are linked, right? What does it mean to define rules on a virtual service, and how do I get to those from the workloads that I see in my metrics?
Right. So I can tell you how we're thinking of doing it now, and we do this today. So I showed you that graph, but we have a whole half of the UI that you didn't see. If you saw our demos, you'll see this. But you click a node, and then we have a link to go look at the details of that node. So you can go to the workload, and we'll actually show you in our service details page, oh, these are the destination rules that apply to this node. These are the virtual services. We can show all kinds of stuff like that. So on that sub pages, on those detail pages, that's when you can start drilling around. Oh, I know the workload. Let me go to the fronting services for that. And then we can show metrics based on that. So we can actually drill down to services, but it's this graph thing is where we're having difficulty trying to figure out how to visualize these things.
Yeah.
To Doug's point, though, I don't think that it's fair to pin any of this on the policy and telemetry group. In that, like fundamentally, the beefs that we have are really systemic to the way that Istio itself is constructed at a very deep level. So I don't know that Doug, I don't know that I can ask you for anything that's within your power to do. More just voicing the concerns that you've.
And it is getting late, right? 1.0 is coming out soon, so.
Yeah, for 1.0, I think the train has already left the station, unfortunately.
Majorly drastic to change here. I don't think it's happening. So I guess this is just a session at this point.
So I do think, though, past 1.0, the config group in particular is maybe the right place where we should really be pushing on how to solve this, because they're in a unique position to sort of define interactions with the system as a whole. And that's where this issue sort of re-raised itself right before 0.8, I think, again, leading to all the changes that echoed down here. So if we're looking for action items, I think we should take the action items and bring it up at the next config group meeting. Is how are we dealing with this, and what's the roadmap for getting some sort of unification across all of Istio? Or at least that's my suggestion. I don't know if others have different opinions.
I mean, at some level, this is, like someone said, right, that this is deeper than actually, this is whole of Istio, really, yeah. Right? Like, so, yeah, I mean, it's, it belongs actually,
TOC.
We should just, it belongs in the TOC, and we should also raise it at the community meeting. This affects all of Istio. So I think, now, where, the reason I think it affects policy and telemetry more and more immediately is because, well, in telemetry, we're in the business of showing things and it affects us right away. And actually, in policy, especially with the virtual service and that kind of thing, it also creates some very interesting questions as to, are you protecting the workload or are you protecting the gate? And that's also kind of another one of those questions that we really need to answer. So I guess on a slightly different note, did the KLE team actually show a demo in the community call? You guys did, right?
Yeah, about a month or two ago we did, yes.
Okay. We should definitely have you like a proper demo, at least in this setting when you get a chance. Because I think we'll be awesome.
These are every 2 weeks you have these meetings, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Why don't we say in 2 weeks from now we'll give you a more official demo.
Okay. So I don't know what else to discuss related to this topic. And I don't have any other topics for today except to say that look out for 1.0. I think they're going to cut a semi-final release today or tomorrow and for final testing. So I don't know, does anyone else have anything else they want to bring up or discuss, either related to what we were just talking about?
I have one really very specific question about the label settings. So let me.
Okay.
So there's two labels. One is destination service namespace. The other is destination workload namespace. And of course, if the request doesn't make it to the server proxy, then destination workload namespace will be unknown. My question is, when it's not unknown, so when it's set, is it expected to be the same value as destination service namespace?
Yes, I think for all Kubernetes examples, they have to be, for in-mesh, in Kubernetes cluster stuff, they have to be the same.
Okay, that's good.
I think
that's what we kind of needed.
I think that's not true for non-Kubernetes, and it's also not true if you hard code an IP address. Right, if you manually construct an object, you can point it anywhere.
So VM expansion cases and things throw a wrench into that equivalence.
I ask that only because we want to drive almost all of the graph generation off of the source side metric telemetry. And therefore, the namespacing, we want to just test against the destination service namespace in general. That's where that's coming from. We wanted to know if it was safe, basically. And we're dealing with Kubernetes / OpenShift in general, so.
Yeah, I think that's generally safe, and actually it works better for like things that leave the mesh for egress traffic too. The service namespace value is present, whereas the workload one will be unknown.
Oh, right. Yeah, that was another question we were just talking about before this meeting, the egress. Okay, good. Thanks.
Okay. I think that's right. Anything else that we should discuss? Otherwise, I think we can call it a day. A couple minutes early.
Did I miss anything interesting?
Yeah, actually. So I think we decided that we need to raise an issue somewhere more pressingly at a higher level to talk about the connection between virtual services and policies and telemetry and how to unify the concepts across Istio.
Yeah. Sounds
awesome. Anyone? Going once? Going twice? Okay. Well, thanks everyone, and thank you, Kali team, for dialing in. I hope we can continue close collaboration moving forward, so we can stay in sync. But this is really helpful to have someone keeping us honest and checking in on how it all works. So thank you.
Thanks for all the help.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for all the help.
Okay. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.